In 1978, two construction workers broke open a sealed stone wall inside an abandoned convent in northern France, and what they found inside that wall should have changed the world, because behind the stones sat a small black diary, wrapped in linen and tied with a cord, and when they opened it they found page after page of a code that no one could read, a code written by a nun whose name almost everyone had forgotten, and yet buried in that code were 3 dated entries, and every single one of them described a war, a real war, written down years before that war ever began. That is the story I want to tell you today, right here on The Secret Nun, the channel where we uncover the hidden stories of brave women who changed history in silence. So if you love stories like this one, stories about courage and secrets and ordinary people who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders, then take 1 second to subscribe right now, because a story this big is only the beginning, and you do not want to miss what comes next. Now let me take you back to 1903, to a small convent built on the edge of a village called St. Auban, where a young woman named Odile walked through the iron gates for the first time, carrying nothing but a single wooden chest and a face that gave away nothing at all. The other sisters noticed her right away, not because she was loud, but because she was so quiet that it felt almost like a shadow had joined them, and while the other novices talked and laughed and shared their fears, Odile kept her thoughts locked behind a small, careful smile. The kind of smile that is really just a door that is kept closed on purpose. Her mother superior watched her for weeks and wrote only 1 sentence about her in the convent record, and that sentence said that the girl was obedient, hardworking, and impossible to read, and looking back now, that last part should have been the first warning. Because every night, after the other sisters had gone to sleep, Odile would sit by the weak light of a single candle and write in a small black diary, and she never wrote in French, and she never wrote in Latin, and she never wrote in any language that a single other person in that convent could understand, because the truth was that Odile had grown up as the daughter of a telegraph operator, a quiet man who spent his life turning words into clicks and clicks into words, and he had taught his daughter every code he knew, not because he expected her to become a spy, but simply because he loved her and had no one else to share his work with. So when Odile wrote in her diary, she wrote in a code that mixed telegraph signals with a private shorthand that only she could read, and she did it for one simple reason, the same reason any of us keeps a diary, because she wanted to be honest with someone, and since she could not be honest with the world, she became honest with the page. For 7 years nothing strange happened, and Odile grew into the life of a nun the way a tree grows into a wall, slowly and quietly and without anyone really noticing, and the villagers came to know her only as the sister who brought bread to the sick and never said more than was needed, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Then, in the winter of 1910, she wrote the first entry that matters, and this is where the story turns, because that entry was not a prayer and it was not a reflection and it was not a memory, it was a prediction, a single dated line that said a great war would come within 4 years, that it would begin with an assassination in a city most people could not find on a map, and that it would swallow the young men of France like a flood swallowing a field. She showed that entry to no one, and she hid the diary beneath a loose floorboard in her cell, and for 4 years she carried that secret the way a person carries a lit match in a storm, holding it close and hoping the wind would not find it. And then in June of 1914, in a city called Sarajevo, a man was shot and killed, and within weeks the whole of Europe was at war, and the young men of St. Auban marched away singing songs about glory, and Odile stood at the convent gate and watched them go, and she did not sing, because she already knew how many of them would not come home. That is the moment the first part of the story really lands, because you have to understand what it would do to a person to see a horror coming, to see it written in your own hand, and to know that no one would ever believe you if you tried to warn them, and that is exactly the weight that settled onto Odile's shoulders and never left her again. The war years broke the village apart, as they broke half of France, and every time a letter arrived with a black border, every time a mother collapsed at the church door, every time a name was read aloud and no one answered, Odile felt the diary pressing against her chest like a second heartbeat, and she began to understand that the gift she had been given was not a gift at all, it was a burden, a terrible burden, because knowing what is coming does not give you the power to stop it, it only gives you the pain of watching it arrive. And so she did the only thing she could do, she kept writing, because the page was the only place where she could put the truth down and rest for a moment, and in the summer of 1918, as the First War finally crawled toward its end, she wrote the second entry, and this one was worse, because it said the peace would not last, that a defeated and humiliated nation would rise again, that a man with a strange name and a burning hatred would turn a whole country into a weapon, and that a second war, a war even larger than the first, would come within 20 years. She wrote it and she read it twice, and then she closed the diary and pressed her forehead against the cold stone wall of her cell, and for the first time since she had arrived at the convent, Odile allowed herself to cry, not because she was afraid, but because she understood now that this was her whole life, to see the future clearly and to be completely, utterly powerless to change it. That is the part of the story where most people would have burned the diary, and I want you to really sit with that for a second, because Odile did not burn it, and the reason she did not burn it is the reason this whole story exists, because somewhere deep inside her she still believed that the words mattered, that if the truth was ever found, even years too late, it might one day teach someone, somewhere, to be braver, and that belief, more than anything else, is what kept her alive through everything that came next. The years between the wars passed in that strange, hollow calm that always comes after a great storm, and Odile watched the world slowly forget what it had promised itself, watched the uniforms come back and the anger start to simmer, watched a failed painter in Germany climb from the gutter to the microphone, and every single thing she saw was a line in her diary, written years before it happened. But here is where the story takes its sharpest turn, because in 1931, the convent received a visitor, and that visitor was not a pilgrim and not a priest from the village, he was a man in a grey coat who carried papers from Rome, and he asked to speak with the sister who was known to keep to herself. The Mother Superior was terrified, because the Vatican does not send a man in a grey coat to a small convent in northern France unless something has gone very wrong, and she led the man to a cold little room and sent for Odile, and Odile walked into that room already knowing what the man was going to say, because in a way she had been waiting for him for years. The man sat across from her and he did not raise his voice and he did not threaten her, he simply told her that the church had heard rumors, small rumors, the kind that travel through the cracks in old stone walls, that one of its sisters possessed a diary written in a secret code, and that the diary was said to contain knowledge of the future, and he asked her, gently, like a man asking a child to hand over a match, to show him what she had written. And Odile looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised even herself, she said no. She said that the diary was not his to read, that it was not a weapon and not a prophecy and not a sin, that it was simply her own private suffering written down, and that she would rather be sent away from the convent forever than hand over the only honest thing she had ever made. The man in the grey coat stared at her for a long time, and then he stood up and left without another word, but before he reached the door he turned and said something that Odile never forgot. He said that a secret is a heavy thing to carry, and that heavy things, when they fall, have a way of crushing the people standing closest to them, and then he was gone, and the door closed, and Odile was left alone with the weight of what she had just done. For the next several years, Odile lived under a shadow, and she knew it, because the church did not punish her and did not expel her and did not even speak of the matter again, which somehow felt worse than punishment, because it meant she was being watched, not by the man in the grey coat, but by something larger and more patient than any single man. And then the Second War came, exactly as she had written, and this time there was no singing at the gates, there was only fear, because the people of France remembered the last war too well, and when the German tanks rolled toward St. Aubin in 1940, Odile did not run, she did not hide, she simply stood at the window of her cell and watched the horizon turn dark, and she understood that every word she had ever written had now come true, and that there was only one entry left, and that it was the one she had been dreading her entire life. And so, in the spring of 1940, with the sound of distant guns rolling across the fields like thunder, Odile took out her diary and wrote the third entry, and this is the entry that the workers would find almost 40 years later, still sealed behind the wall, and this is the entry that nobody in the world has ever been able to fully explain, because the third entry was not about a war between nations, it was about something far more terrifying, and she did not write it as a warning to the world. She wrote it as a message to one person, and that one person, if the story is true, might be listening to this right now. But before I tell you what that third entry said, I need to tell you how the diary got into the wall, because that part matters, because it tells you everything you need to know about the kind of woman Odile really was. In the autumn of 1940, as the occupation tightened around the village like a hand closing into a fist, Odile understood that her time was running out, that the man in the grey coat had been right, that a secret carried too long eventually becomes too heavy, and that if the diary fell into the wrong hands, into the hands of the soldiers who were now stationed less than a mile from the convent, It would not just destroy her, it would destroy the sisters she loved and the village that had sheltered her and everything she had ever cared about. So she did the only thing a woman who had spent her life being honest with the page could do. She made a decision, the hardest decision of her life. She decided to bury the truth where it could not hurt anyone, but also where it could never be destroyed, and that is why, on a cold night in October of 1940, she slipped out of her cell with the diary clutched against her chest, and she walked through the dark corridors of the convent until she found a small storage room at the back of the chapel. A room that had been unused for years, and there, using a small hammer she had taken from the garden shed, she began to pry loose the stones of the outer wall, one by one, working by moonlight, her hands bleeding, her breath coming in short white clouds, until she had made a space just large enough for the little black book, and she slid the diary into the wall, and she wrapped it in linen, and she tied it with a cord, and then she put the stones back, one by one, sealing the secret away, and when she was finished she pressed her hand flat against the cold stone and whispered a single sentence, a sentence that no one else would ever hear, and then she walked back to her cell and lay down on her narrow bed and closed her eyes. That was the last night Odile ever wrote in her diary, and I need you to understand that, because everything that happened after that night happened to a woman who was no longer carrying the future, a woman who had finally, after all those years, put the weight down, and that is why what happened next is not the tragedy that it might have been, it is the end of one kind of courage and the beginning of another. Because Odile did not die that winter, and she did not die the next spring, she lived on through the entire occupation, and she spent those years doing the bravest work of her life, not writing prophecies, but acting on them. Because the sister who had once seen the future and felt powerless now chose to fight with the only weapon she had left, her courage, and the records that survived the war tell us that the quiet nun from St. Alban hid Jewish children in the convent cellar, that she forged travel papers at a desk in the chapel, that she lied to German officers with a calm face and a steady voice, and that not one single child under her care was ever discovered, and I think about that all the time, because it tells you something essential about who Odile really was, that she had spent her whole life believing she was powerless, and when the moment finally came, when the future she had seen finally arrived, she discovered that she was not powerless at all, that the gift she had called a curse had actually been preparing her, all those years, for the one moment that truly mattered. She survived the war, against every odd, and she stayed at the convent for the rest of her life, growing old and quiet and kind, and the younger sisters who lived with her in those later years said that she never spoke about the war and never spoke about herself, but that sometimes, late at night, they would pass by her door and hear her whispering, and they always had the strange feeling that she was not whispering to God, but to someone else, someone they could not see, and that detail, more than any other, is the one that makes my skin go cold, because by then the diary was already sealed in the wall, and whatever Odile was whispering about on those nights, she took the answer to her grave. She died in the spring of 1968, at the age of 82, and she was buried in the small convent cemetery beneath a simple stone that carried only her name and the dates of her life, and for 10 years after her death, the secret of the wall stayed exactly where she had put it, silent and patient, waiting. And that brings us back to where we started, to 1978, to 2 construction workers and a sledgehammer and a wall that had stood for 100 years, and I want you to picture the moment as clearly as I can describe it, because it is the moment the whole story has been building toward, the moment a worker swung his hammer and the stones gave way and a small wrapped bundle tumbled out into the dust, and the 2 men knelt down and unwrapped it with the care of people who understood, even before they understood, that they were touching something that did not belong to them, and they found the little black diary, and they opened it, and they found page after page of symbols that looked like the scratches a bird might make in the sand, and they knew, both of them, in that instant, that they had found something that would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet old convent on the hill. The diary was taken to the church, and then to scholars, and then to codebreakers, and the code, it turned out, was not hard to break once they understood what they were looking at, because Odile had not written it to be unbreakable, she had written it to be private, and within months the experts had translated every page, and that is when the story exploded, because the first 2 entries were dated 1910 and 1918, and they described, in calm, clear detail, the 2 wars that had already happened, wars that had not yet begun when the words were written, and the scholars checked and rechecked the ink and the paper and the dates, and every test came back the same, and the conclusion was unavoidable, and it was impossible, and it was true. A nun in a forgotten village in France had written down the future, not once, but twice, and both times she had been right. But it was the third entry that truly ended the argument, and it was the third entry that the church, after reading it, tried very hard to make disappear, because the third entry was not about a war that had already happened, and it was not about a war between armies at all, and the more the scholars studied it, the more they understood that Sister Odile had saved the most important message of her life for last, and that she had sealed it in a wall not to hide it, but to protect it, and to make sure that it would only be found by someone who was truly looking. So what did the third entry actually say? And here, my friend, is where I have to ask you to lean in, because this is the part of the story that I have been waiting to tell you since the very first sentence. The third entry was dated 1940, and translated into plain English, it said this, that she, Odile, had seen 2 wars come, and had watched the world learn nothing from either of them, and that a third war was coming, not a war of soldiers and bombs, but a war that would be fought in silence, inside the hearts of ordinary people, a war between belief and despair, between courage and fear, between the people who choose to see the truth and the people who choose to look away, and that this war had already begun, and that it would not end with a treaty, and that it would not be won by armies, and that the only people who could win it were people like the ones listening to her words, ordinary people, quiet people, the kind of people who never make the history books, but who, when the moment comes, decide to be brave anyway. And the final line of the diary, the very last thing Sister Odile ever wrote before she sealed her secret behind the stones, was not a prophecy at all, it was a prayer, and it said simply, "Do not be afraid of the future, because the future is only made by the people who refuse to run from it." And then she signed her name, and she closed the book, and she walked out into the cold October night to bury the only honest thing she had ever made. And that is the story of the nun who kept a coded diary that predicted 3 wars before they happened, and I want you to notice something, because it matters, because the first 2 wars she predicted with her eyes, but the third war she did not predict, she warned against it, and she did not warn against it with fear, she warned against it with the deepest, quietest kind of courage, the courage of a woman who had seen the worst the world could do and had still chosen, every single day, to believe that ordinary people could be good. So now I have to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, because this is the part of the video where your voice matters as much as mine. Which part of this story hit you the hardest? The moment she saw the first war coming and said nothing, the moment she refused to hand her diary to the man in the grey coat, or the final line of the diary itself? Tell me in the comments below, because I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know which of those 3 moments stayed with you longest. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel even a little bit braver, then do not keep it to yourself. Share this video with one person, just one person who needs to hear it today, because a story like this is not meant to sit in a sealed wall, it is meant to be passed from hand to hand, and you never know whose life it might change. And if you are new here and you made it all the way to the end, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was made for, so hit that subscribe button. Before you go, turn on the notification bell, and become part of the Secret Nun family, because there are so many more hidden stories like this one, stories of brave women and wartime heroes and secret missions and acts of kindness that changed the course of history, and I promise you, the next one is even more unbelievable than this one. Until then, keep your eyes open and your heart brave, because the quietest people are often the ones carrying the biggest secrets, and you never know which of them is watching over your life right now.